All right, so this is the Biology 251, Chapter 15 study points. And as of spring 2025 spring semester, we only went up to slide 25. So I'm only going to cover study points that went up to slide 25. To begin with, understand the different types of infectious diseases, nosocomial, zoonotic, etc. So nosocomials basically is infections that are acquired or you got from a hospital. It's basically transmission through improperly sterilized items or via a sick medical professional. Zoonotic is where it's from animal to humans. So, for example, this dog might have like rabies, and then that's transmitted to a human. Non-communicable is a disease that's not spread from person to person. So it'll be like Clostridium tetani. So basically, like if you were to get, you were to step on a nail, and then you're gonna get tetanus. You didn't get that from a person. You got that from the nail. Explain what a pathogen is and what is meant by pathogenicity. So pathogen is a colonized microbe capable of causing harm to a host. Basically, it's what makes us sick. And pathogenicity is the ability of a bacteria or a microorganism to cause disease. So the more pathogenic it is, the more deadly it will be. Explain virulence as it relates to microorganism, virus, or toxin. So virulence is degree of pathogenicity. So virulence is how bad a pathogen can be, how deadly it could be. And not all pathogens have the same characteristics and determine virulence. So basically what it's saying is that not all pathogens have the same characteristics. Like they're not all going to be this deadly or this non-deadly. Describe what virulence factors are. So a virulence factor is basically how microbes evade like host defenses and determines extent and severity of the disease. So basically these are just like buffs that they have, like superpowers that they have, right? So for example, microbe can have adhesions. So remember, if a microbe cannot attach, it cannot affect. So whether or not it has an adhesion factor determines whether or not it can even infect. But adhesions, for example, like pili, flagella, or the mycolic acid waxy layer, or like an encapsulated bacteria, those factors help a microbe attach to the host. And exoenzymes and endotoxins, produce exotoxins, endotoxins. Endotoxins and exotoxins basically very bad. It makes the pathogen more deadly, right? Or more toxic. Antiphagocytic factors. So basically, it basically is where the human cell cannot like engulf the bacteria to kill it, if that makes sense. Because phagocytosis is where the cell like engulfs another cell. Biofilm formation, like I said, that biofilm is a part of adhesion factor. So basically, if it's able to produce a biofilm, the more likely it's able to adhere. Phase variation and antigenetic shifts. Don't really need to know those last two. What is an opportunistic pathogen? And note examples we discussed in class. So an opportunistic pathogen is basically a pathogen that is already in the host's like body, and it causes an infection if the host becomes compromised. So for example, right, this human, they got this sickness, right? They got this disease, and then they're finally, everything was good. They're like, they took their medicine and they felt better. But since, after infection, remember that after infection, the body is like not at its best, right? Because it took a lot of the like energy of the body to fight off that infection. So now it's weak and it's compromised. So an opportunistic pathogen basically like sees that as compromised and it's like, I think it's a good time to infect this patient. And basically it's just a bacteria that usually does not infect a patient, but can infect an immunocompromised patient. And if the patient is already immunocompromised, meaning that they have like a weaker immune system, then they're also more susceptible to these opportunistic pathogens. And an example is Staphylococcus epidermidis. So a Staphylococcus epidermidis, it's really not like harmful at all. It just kind of like lives on our skin. But if a patient is in the hospital, they can, what's it called? Get a nosocomial infection. And remember that nosocomial infections basically are acquired via hospital. Distinguish between signs and symptoms. So signs. Some signs can be observed and measured. The changes in vital signs may indicate disease, presence of antibodies, or antibodies often remain after infection has cleared. And a symptom is very subjective. Think about the Wong-Baker faces. Those Wong-Baker faces are the one where it's like, rate your pain level from 1 to 10. And it's like a sad, crying face for like 10, and then a happy green face for 1. And it's basically, it cannot be objectively measured. Explain the course of infectious disease. Explain the course of infectious diseases and understand what is happening during each of the phases and the factors that can affect what happens during each phase. So incubation period is basically where a pathogen has entered the host and begun to multiply. A prodromal period is where the pathogen continues to multiply, but the patient now begins to experience symptoms and immune system is activated and immune response begins. Illness is where the host experiences the most severe symptoms. Decline is where the immune system basically downregulates its attack and decreases the number of pathogens in the body, and the symptoms begin to decline. And after decline is where the immune system is overall weakened, like I mentioned before. The immune system is weakened and the pathogen is now depleted, but now the patient is still at risk of secondary infection. And convalescence, convalescence is where we fully recover and our body recuperates. And in this entire course of infection, if there's more pathogens, the more severe this entire process is. But also another thing you need to know is that immune system during this state of decline, the reason why a lot of doctors, they prescribe the initial treatment, which could be like antibiotics administered via IV, and then they tell the patient that they need to do another round of antibiotics, but like pill form. It's just so that we can prevent that second infection from happening. Explain influenza virus infection and common secondary infection example discussed in class. So a patient gets influenza and they go through an entire course of infection. But now the immune system is depleted after decline and highly susceptible to secondary pneumonia. Okay, and now the patients are often given antibiotics as second treatment to prevent secondary infection. That's what I literally just went over earlier. Define, explain acute, chronic, latent, and know the examples we discuss. Acute illness is where it's a short-term illness where pathogen is eliminated by host defenses in a short time. So think about strep throat, the flu. And illness can be acquired again, but we get different strains or by having a weaker immune system. That's why every single year, like they're like, get your flu shots, because there's always like different strains of the flu that you can get. Chronic is an illness that persists over a long time, so not completely cleared. The viruses or the bacteria or the illness is not completely cleared and takes a long time to get rid of completely. And think about H. pylori or tuberculosis. Latent is where an illness can recur if the immune system weakens. So basically, the disease just stays in the body like dormant, and then the disease comes back in times of like decline, right? When we have a weakened immune system after we just went through a whole infection, right? And then we're in a state in decline. Now we could get like shingles out of nowhere, because our immune system is weakened and it basically rewoke in the body. Understand the limitations of Koch's postulates. So basically, Koch's postulates, remember, is that like if we can isolate this bacteria, we can put it in another animal for it to recreate that infection over and over and over again. Basically, isolating the bacteria, putting it in another cow, taking it out, putting in another cow, taking it out, putting in another cow, and they all have the same symptoms, right? However, the limitations of Koch's postulates is that not all infectious agents have the same signs and symptoms in all patients. So when we say, oh, they should have, when we put the disease in another cow, they should have the same symptoms. That's not very accurate or possible, to be exact, simply because not all infectious agents have the same signs and symptoms in all patients. One cow could be super sick, and then the next cow could not be sick, even though they're given the same bacterial infection. And not all pathogens can be grown on a pure culture. Some pathogens can also cause different diseases depending on virulence factors produced. Explain the host factors that can affect the establishment of an infectious disease. Route of entry is where the pathogen first enters. So basically via mouth, via like liquid, like sexually transmitted liquids, or or we breathe it in, right? It's either of those. Age, so we have to think infants don't really have a well-developed immune system, or neither do elderly. Their immune system is already weakened when they get old. So that is a host factor. And health, if you're an immunocompromised patient, you're gonna have a harder time fighting off infections. But if you're a healthy adult that works out often, eats healthy, you're less likely to really be affected as badly as an unhealthy individual. And immune status of the host, which correlates with health. Now, the 4 steps of pathogenesis. The first step is exposure. Second, attachment, invasion, and infection. So exposure, like I said, first encounter with pathogens where the pathogen gains access to host. Like I said, respiratory, GI tract, broken skin. Attachment. Basically, this is how the pathogen, even after it enters, it attaches to one of our host cell receptors, and then they use adhesion factors like biofilm or slime layers and capsules to attach to the host cells. An example of this is a biofilm of Pseudomonas in cystic fibrosis patients, burn wounds or ear infections. Invasion. Pathogen spreads throughout the body, so virulence factors are produced, either toxins or exoenzymes. And infection and damage to the host. And then that's it.